no.
Oh, hello. You've reached another episode of the WordsWise Podcast, where we talk all things philosophy. Today, we are discussing creation myths of the humankind, specifically the Maidu, Norse, and Greek traditions. Please join us. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the WordsWise Podcast. I'm Jonah Bell.
Jesse Wikoski.
Dan West.
Chadwick Raymer.
Today, we are talking about myths of creation, humankind. So, Jesse, what do you say? Let's start us off.
Okay. Well, my creation myth is from the Maidu, the Nisenan Maidu, our local tribe here in Central California. I did want to preface this by saying I am not of the tribe, but I give this story in complete respect to the tribe. They have taken me in, taught me a lot, allowed me to be a spirit runner for their first reinvigoration of calling back the salmon. So I give the story not as misappropriation, but in the humility to pass it on to the viewers. This is from the late, great Professor Hotchkiss's anthology, Now the Storm is Over, and I just give a brief summary. Coyote creates mankind. After Worldmaker created the land and planted the giant oak tree, he tasked Ulemi the turtle and Pehepeolele the Coyote Clown to seek out the animal people in order to generate mankind. After this proclamation, Worldmaker's robes burned as hot as could be, and he was gone. When all the animals gathered together, a heated debate ensued regarding the formation of the people. Elk believed they should have mighty antlers. Puma thought they should have sharp teeth and claws. Salmon discerned that they should swim up the rivers. Rattlesnake saw no reason for arms and legs. Condor was certain they should have widespread wings. Frog imagined large lungs to bellow in the night. The arguing continued until all grew tired and fell asleep. All save Coyote, who fashioned the people to look as we do now. When Pano the grizzly saw that the people resembled the bear, greatest of the animals, yet smaller and with no fur, he approved, as did all the other creatures of the earth. Coyote snickered, knowing that he had given the human beings a cunning mind like his own. So a common theme for indigenous New Worlders is that animals are people. More so in the before time. Like somehow in this modern era, they've lost the people that are the connection to being equals, so to speak.
They're people in the sense that they are spirits and souls, just like people are.
Sure, they also speak and have almost somewhat of the intelligence as humanity. You can maybe even say flip-flop it and say that people are animals,
Mm-hmm.
which is, of course, what science says.
Right.
Um,
Cool.
Another thing, and this is a common theme I've noticed throughout a lot of our myths, going back to the creation of man, the world itself also, is there's a creator god that departs. Like in this one, World Maker burnt up and was gone. And that's also, it was true with the myth of the Kung San, where the trickster god Kang left to view his creation in secrecy. So this idea of almost, even in the myths where there is an omnipresent god, it's almost just on the peripheries. That makes sense.
Yeah, he designs the scene and then he sits back to watch the show. The director.
There's also kind of the vice versa trickiness of God in man's image, or man in God's image kind of theme that runs throughout a lot of myths of humankind creation as well. Something Joseph Campbell brings up is that near the equator, the lion is known as like the king of the jungle, the king of the animals. But as you get more towards the North Pole, bear takes the place of lion. He is the king of the animals. And in this one, bear definitely had the grizzly, definitely had that, like he held sway over whether what Coyote did was right or not. And it's also one of the few animals that occasionally gets up on two legs. If anyone had anything to chime in on that.
One of the things I'd like to mention is just in context to what I will talk about in the Greeks' creation of man and woman, was the idea that the gifting of aspects to animals was really interesting. You know, they gave them specific things, you know, whatever god it was, gave them claws or antlers or fur. You see that theme also in the Greeks, to where when Prometheus gave his brother the task of, you know, tasking out what the gifts were to be to all the creatures that they had just created, including man, he gave all the animals all these aspects so they'd be powerful and they could survive and be in the environment and survive the weather. Whereas when it came to mankind, it was like sort of an afterthought, which is exactly what Epimetheus's name means. He just sort of forgot to give man anything, so that's why we're naked and we're. So I thought that was interesting because when you look at nature, animals in general, you see they're equipped well for their environment. Whereas if you look at us, honestly, I mean, even in the classical Greek art, you really do see that, well, we're naked for a reason. You know, we don't have really the kind of defenses that you would expect a thing to have in this world, where things are very harsh. The weather's harsh. It's not always nice, and you have lots of things that want to kill you in nature. And the fact that we are as we are, it's like the only thing that we really have is our mind, which ironically is what Prometheus means as forethought. So he's the thinker, whereas Epimetheus' brother is the fool. And yet he was tasked with giving these abilities to the animals and the creatures of the earth. So I thought that was an interesting correlation between, you know, the two being completely separate, yet they have pretty similar themes.
True, and almost Coyote in this one was called the Coyote Clown. So he almost added both aspects you're talking about,
Right.
where it's forethought in the fool.
Right. Yeah.
And as you mentioned before, the trickster, which is Coyote in this one, a common theme among many cultures, is the ambiguous god, like you said. And he had almost the forethought. Every other creature thought egotistically, like, I want man to look like me. Coyote had the forethought to go a little beyond. Like, no one's going to let me do this if I just create little Coyote or whatnot. but I'm going to give you the mind. So he worked more on an internal level than the external.
Right. Yeah, in context to that too, I think the Greek twins were a very common theme amongst not just the Greeks, but many ancient cultures. And their aspects and the reasons why and the symbolism associated with that are varied. But I think Epimetheus and Prometheus are twins. I think that was probably their original aspect. Because honestly, if you think about it, they're describing states of the mind. So I think it's one mind that they're talking about. So on the one hand, you have the critical thinker, the cunning nature of Prometheus, who was known for being very cunning. He even fooled Zeus. But then on the other hand, you have the very foolish, non-thinking, very base aspect of the mind, which is his brother Epimetheus. So in that respect, I would say that they are actually really describing a single person, the nature of man in general, or woman, where we have both sides. You have the critical thinker as well as the foolish, more base nature of humanity.
Two sides making up the whole.
Yeah.
It's like Qui-Gon Jinn and Jar Jar Binks.
Right. There you go.
All together.
That's right.
The last thing I wanted to throw in was the idea of scientific fact and mythical truth. So, in my mind, some myths are probably just made up BS, so to speak. But some actually have this, Chad brought this up earlier, it's a kernel of truth that maybe was held from a historical event, a geological event, whatnot. Even if we don't have scientific dating to it, that's mythical truth. It may not rely upon scientific fact. And this myth, I think, has some of that in that, where, of course, we're not made from coyote, scientifically, biologically, but the idea that we are the clever, adaptable versions of an animal,
Right.
and coyote best represented it to these people. I find that to have an inherent mythological truth outside of science.
Absolutely.
It's a good story. It's a good one. Are you up next, Dan?
I guess I am.
Let me lead you in.
Okay. All right, I like it. So I chose the Norse human creation mythology. I knew nothing about it. My one disclaimer is in doing some of the research, I found some contradictory facts depending on which websites I looked at. So at this point, I'm still not sure. I would have to find a really solid textbook or some scientific reference, maybe something else.
Unfortunately, I don't think there is. I mean, that's like with the Greeks too. I mean, it's one thing I found in the Norse as well. Is like you're limited, and there is a lot of contradiction. So
Norse is a large enough area and tribal group that each sub-tribe within that area had maybe a different retelling.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Talking of it is it changes the indigenous.
All stories are subject to the game telephone.
Yeah. Well said. So the basic outline of the story is that there was a void known as the I'm going to try and pronounce this word, Ginung Agap. And the Ginung Agap was kind of like a formless void. In addition to that, there was some websites called the Muspel, also referenced as the Muspelheim or Heim. And that was a place of extreme heat, burning fire. Only things that were native to that land could exist there. In a sharp contrast to that was the Niflheim. The Niflheim was a realm of ice and frost, cold, chilling, frozen.
The land of the giants.
And in between, there happened this intermingling of the cold and hot in this Ginungagap region. And this enormous being, he's called a frost giant. I would even say he's a titan or a behemoth, something like that, known as Ymir. And Ymir basically went and took a nap. And this is where the stories begin to differ a little bit. Basically, they all say that from his sweat, the various beings came from his body. Some say that the first man and woman came from under one of his arms, and that another human came from his leg. Some of the other versions of the myth say that he created gods. So it's a bit unclear exactly what Ymir produced. But after that, all the stories pretty much go about the same way. Ymir eventually is he's suckled by a cow named Althumla, and Althumla is this cow and starts to lick these giant ice blocks, and out of the giant ice blocks, eventually a man comes out. Again, it's not quite clear if it's a man or a god, but so Buri is the name of this first god, and Buri is joined by Bor and Bestla. These are like these really god, maybe proto-human beings, and eventually Bor is at the beach, and these two tree stumps are washing up on the shore, and he takes them and creates the first man and woman. So it's a little unclear as to whether the first man and woman came from Ymir or whether they were created out of the tree stumps by Bor. That's where it's a little difficult to determine exactly what happened. But eventually Ymir dies, and the flesh becomes the earth. The blood creates a flood, another flood creation story behind that. The brains become the clouds. It's very descriptive. The bones become the mountains, and so forth. And but that's the basic creation of the human beings from the Norse.
Yeah, I've read all those, and yeah, it's kind of hard. It's really difficult to tell what's really going on. Unfortunately, they didn't start to write this stuff down until much later. So you're really left with a lot of conjecture as far as how the original stories were, and they were heavily influenced by the Catholic, Church at that time too. So what I find interesting about many of these stories is that, especially this one in context, you have these realms in which there's extreme heat, and then there's extreme cold, and then there's this sort of temperate existence afterwards. The earth is created. So there's always this kind of idea that there was maybe a chaos or some sort of time frame beforehand. What I find interesting, and there are theories about, like what Jesse was saying as far as the origin or the kernel of truth to many of these myths, is that if you think about it in the context of extreme heat and then extreme cold, well, if you had a comet impact, that was either exploded in our atmosphere or came very close to the earth, and we were, essentially affected by the tail of it, which some theories have been promoted that do describe this, and what would happen if that occurred. You would have extreme heat, you'd have fires, absolute devastation, and then you would have a state of extreme cold afterwards, because you'd have essentially what's kind of like a nuclear winter. And then after so many years, eventually the earth would recover and you would have more of a temperate climate. This is the same in the Greek myths too, where you have the different ages of the earth: the golden age, and then you have the silver age, then the bronze, which is the age of heroes, and then you have essentially what we have now, which is the Iron Age. And the Golden Age, again, it's this sort of classical idea of a, not necessarily utopia, but it was it was as close to it as you can get, I guess. I mean, there was no death, there was little disease. People didn't really have to struggle or work very hard. The climate was temperate.
Fruit fell from the trees into your hands.
Right. Yeah. Labor was very nil, if at all. silver, man became very decadent and weak, and they had to be essentially eradicated. And you can get to the Bronze Age is when it gets really interesting, because the Bronze Age coincides essentially, as what we understand of it, is the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age of what we consider history. And the Age of Heroes, coincides with that. And if you look at that time frame in history, like we've discussed before, is that this is an era where you do have the possibility of there being a significant comet impact. And what's interesting about that is that after this sort of, hero age, there is a massive devastation. And what is brought in after this devastation, it's not clear if it's really a flood. That's supposed to happen, I guess, either before that or after, depending on what you read. But there is a devastation, and what coincides after that is the Iron Age, but it's much more difficult to till the soil. It's much more difficult to actually, live in general.
So when you were originally talking about the Bronze Age, I assumed you were talking about that was the age where man learned to smelt bronze and work with it. But now it sounds like you were talking about gold and silver and bronze, as in they're in relationship. That's just a title for some sort of time period.
That's how the Greeks put it, the ancient Greek poets. But I was actually talking about the Bronze Age is the age at which bronze was being used prolifically for weapons, armor, even in art and so forth. So this was an age at which bronze was prolific. It just so happens that it coincides, somewhat overlaps with what the time of heroes, what the Greeks called. And after this period, you have essentially what is described by a lot of poets of the Greeks is like, well, it's much more difficult. We don't have the soil in the temperate climate anymore like we used to. We have much more extremes in weather, and the soil is much more difficult to till. There's a lot more labor involved and so forth. So in short, after being a really long-winded sort of sentence, is that basically I think what happened is there is something that happened historically.
Like a comet or some sort of event.
If it's not a comet, maybe something. But it had to have been a very large, at least much greater than a regional event to be able to have these kinds of ideas introduced.
And going back to your story, Dan, one thing that I thought was interesting was that all of this life was coming from some form of water. It was either sweat or it was ice being licked. And we were already talking about how water is the life element, but that's not always true. For example, the Christian story of the creation of man is God creating Adam out of clay. So that's earth.
But also to that is both the sweat and the salt block would be an association with salt. Your sweat being really salty.
Right.
That's kind of interesting. Again, going to like the idea of like the Indian Hellish, where you have essentially the clear waters of the deep, and then you have the salt water of the ocean too, as being aspects.
There's a mythical truth in that it was body excretions that brought about humanity. Scientific fact would show us, well, maybe sweat doesn't bring us about, but it's sperm and ovaries or whatnot.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Good point.
Cool, man.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very nice. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to be briefly going over a synopsis of what is considered. There are a couple different variations as to what the origins of man and woman, because they're distinct in Greek mythology. Briefly, I'm just going to go over what would be considered the indigenous, earliest known origin story of both man and woman. The first natural belief of the Greek people was that man had sprung from the earth. They saw the tender plants and flowers force their way through the ground in the early spring of the year after the frost of winter had disappeared. And so they naturally concluded that man must also have issued from the earth in a similar manner. Like the wild plants and flowers, he was supposed to have no cultivation, and resembled in his habits the untamed beasts of the field, having no habitation except that which nature had provided in the holes of the rocks, and in the dense forest whose overarching boughs protected him from the inclemency of the weather. In the course of time, these primitive human beings became tamed and civilized by the gods and heroes, who taught them to work in metals, to build houses, and other useful arts of civilization. But the human race became, in the course of time, so degenerate that the gods resolved to destroy all mankind by means of flood. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha, being on account of their piety the only mortals saved, by the command of his father Deucalion had built a ship. Prometheus warned Deucalion of Zeus's want to destroy mankind, in which he and his wife took refuge during the deluge, which lasted for 9 days. When the waters abated, the ship rested on Mount Othrys in Thessaly. Deucalion and his wife now consulted the oracle of Themis as to how the human race might be restored. The answer was that they were to cover their heads and throw their bones of their mother behind them. For some time they were perplexed as to the meaning of the oracular command, but at length both agreed that the bones of their mother was meant the stones of the earth. They accordingly took up stones from the mountainside and cast them over their shoulders. From those thrown by Deucalion there sprang up men, and from those thrown by Pyrrha, women. After the lapse of time, the theory of autochthony, which is essentially the indigenous folklore, was laid aside. And what we have after this time frame is essentially temples being built, priesthoods, these kinds of cult gatherings. It became much more sophisticated in how it developed after this time frame. So what we're talking about is sort of prehistoric concept of what the Greeks believed were their origins. Now, if you get back to what we know of as the poetic form of Greek origins of man, you have to go to Hesiod. He's the earliest known writer that we have that talks about the theogony, which is the origin of the gods, and then the works and days is specific works that describe the creation of man by Prometheus. So Prometheus, not only did he have a role in the more archaic versions of mankind, but also in the earlier or the later versions as well. The Titan Prometheus, the son of Iapetus, had formed man out of clay, and that Athena had breathed a soul into him. Full of love for the beings he had called into existence, Prometheus determined to elevate their minds and improve their condition in every way. He therefore taught them astronomy, mathematics, the alphabet, how to cure diseases, and the art of divination. He created this race in such great numbers that the gods began to see the necessity of instituting certain fixed laws with regard to the sacrifices due to them, and the worship to which they considered themselves entitled from mankind in return for the protection which they accorded them. An assembly was therefore convened at Mycenae. In order to settle these points, it was decided that Prometheus, as the advocate of man, should slay an ox, which should be divided into 2 equal parts, and that the gods should select one portion which should henceforth in all future sacrifices be set apart for them. Prometheus so divided the ox that one part consisted of the bones, which formed, of course, the least valuable portion of the animal, artfully concealed by white fat, whilst the other contained all the edible parts, which he covered with the skin, and on top he laid the stomach. Zeus, being a person of great cunning, and he was able to see into the future. It was very difficult to trick Zeus, and this is a classical theme. Zeus, pretending to be deceived, chose the heap of bones, but he saw through the stratagem and was so angry at the deception practiced on him by Prometheus that he avenged himself by refusing to mortals the gift of fire. Prometheus, however, resolved to brave the anger of the great ruler of Olympus and to obtain from heaven the vital sparks so necessary for the further progress and comfort of the human race. He accordingly contrived to steal some sparks from the chariot of the sun, which he conveyed to earth hidden in a hollow tube or a fennel stalk. Furious at being again outwitted, Zeus determined to be revenged first on mankind and then on Prometheus. To punish the former, he commanded Hephaestus. Now, this is where we get into the creation of woman. This is a very separate event that takes place, which is kind of unusual. I've never read any other story where both man and woman were. I mean, I'm sure it exists, but
Well, it's like the Christian one, he makes man, and then from man he makes woman. But this seems like it's a lot longer down the
A
timeline.
huge
Right.
time gap.
but
Yeah.
the creator was the same, whereas this it's not.
Oh.
Right.
So Hephaestus to mold a beautiful woman out of clay, Pandora. So it's Hephaestus who actually creates woman, not Prometheus, which is interesting.
And Hephaestus is the smith god, right?
Yeah, he's the fire god, the smithy. He basically is the god of like mechanical arts and engineering and those kinds of things. You know, he was very the smith would be like what we consider like an engineer, you know. So, and determined that through her instrumentality, trouble and misery should be brought into the world. The gods were so charmed with the graceful and artistic creation of Hephaestus that they all determined to endow her with some special gift. Hermes bestowed on her a smooth, persuasive tongue. In most cases, he just gave her voice, so he was in charge of giving her actual voice. Aphrodite gave her beauty and the art of pleasing. Sorry, ladies. The Graces made her cunning, and Athena, Minerva, gifted her with the possession of feminine accomplishments. She was called Pandora, which means all gifted, having received every attribute necessary to make her charming and irresistible. Now,
So real quickly, Aphrodite was around before Pandora, but she was a female god.
yeah. Whereas Pandora was a female woman.
Human woman.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So basically, Prometheus, according to the Greeks, the more common understanding is that Prometheus created mankind. He essentially took the earth and he took some water and he created a clay mold of man. And he was responsible for pretty much all aspects of man. The only thing that he did not do, that he assigned to his brother, Epimetheus, was to basically clothe man with the abilities to protect himself, not only from animals but from weather. You know, and give him gifts that would essentially allow his survival, which is why when Epimetheus forgot to do that, he bestowed those gifts upon all the animals but forgot mankind. This was the reason why Prometheus felt he had to steal fire from Zeus. So he made this plan to go, okay, well, I'm going to go take fire, and, you know, who cares what this tyrant Zeus has to say about it? And that's what he did. What's interesting about Prometheus, the dynamic between Prometheus and Zeus, is that Zeus allowed himself to be fooled the first time. The second time he was fooled, which is really, really
Right.
interesting because he supposedly can't be. And yet this time, Prometheus was actually able to steal the fire from the chariot of Apollo. And he was able to hide that away in a fennel stalk and took that and gave that to mankind. Of course, you know, Zeus had his revenge on man through Pandora, which was no fault of her own. She was just all gifted. She was beautifully created. I mean, if you really read the text, she's perfect. All the gods gave all the best aspects to her. The only thing about it, the context of Pandora that really puts her in a bad light, is that she was curious. When she was gifted to mankind, she was actually gifted first to Epimetheus, who is the non-thinker. He's the fool, right? Well, he had a jar that had all the gifts of mankind inside of it. Some people call it a box. And Prometheus told Epimetheus, by no means should you ever open this box. This is by command of Zeus. Well, by the cunning of Zeus, he gave Pandora to Epimetheus, knowing she would want to open it. And that's what happened. She opens the box or the jar, and all of man's gifts go flying out into the ether and are gone. And she quickly closes the box or the jar lid, and the only thing left is hope. So that's where Pandora gets sort of this bad rap as being like this first woman in the Greek mythology. But otherwise, her very name means all gifted. So take that as you will. Ultimately, I just find it interesting more that Prometheus created mankind, and it was a different god that created woman. And that it wasn't just him. It was all the gods, the chief gods of the pantheon, that gave a gift to woman, whereas it was just really Prometheus that created mankind. So
That does seem very different from most of the creation myths, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Man and women seem to be created together, at least most of the time, except for the exception you mentioned about the woman coming from man's rib. But this is a whole different.
right, but
Created
even
one.
in that sense, though, it's still God taking the rib from man, so it's still the one entity creating it. Whereas this, you have
Right.
multiple different entities, creating a woman versus man. So I think it does two things, and this is like gets into some sort of complex territory as far as the context of classical, thinking. But there was a great elevation of woman and the beauty and aspects of womanhood in that time frame. But there was also this sort of patriarchy too, where it was like man came first, and well, because of what happened from the curiosity of this woman, all these ailments fell upon mankind. So you have like a really stark dichotomy there. Whereas they're elevating woman, but at the same time, it's like, well, she also kind of, brought on misery to man. So
She's
that's
not
an
allowed to
interesting-
outshine man. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. It's an interesting point because when I remember hearing the stories of Pandora, I was under the impression that it was all of the plagues and diseases of mankind that was being released. But this story, it's actually the reverse. It's all of the wholesome and good qualities being escaped to the ether.
Good,
So,
good and bad.
yeah, it's essentially like there are some different interpretations of that. Essentially, the gods bestowed upon man all of the gifts, right? Zeus pulled back fire because he was unhappy with what Prometheus had done. So, but ultimately, it was supposed to have been originally, from what we understand, the box or the jar, I think is what it originally was a jar, was contained all of these, the good things, the gifts that were associated with, giving to mankind by the gods. And when those things left the jar, they were gone. So that opened mankind to all those ailments, disease and death and toiling, these kinds of things. So, and the only thing that was really left in there was hope that mankind could rise above, and be better, and regardless of all of the strifes of life and ailments that therein, they could rise above that. So
One thing I pick up is she's called the All Gifted. That to me, women symbolize, and I think is quite literally where life is generated. She delivers the gift of life.
that's interesting. Yeah.
Whether it be So the mother giving birth, whether it be a horrible child or a blessed savior, the box kind of fits in with that category too. The womb in the box. I see that, at least my own correlation.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely see it that way for sure. I mean, who's to say that that wasn't part of their, multi-layered meaning? It's one thing we find amongst the Greeks that it's hard to tell sometimes what they're meaning because there were so many associated meanings to it. Like, I mean, Prometheus, it's really kind of hard to tell, like, who he really was. In fact, you talk about trickster gods. That's exactly what Prometheus was. He was kind of the outcast. He was kind of pissed off at Zeus for like imprisoning all of his family in Tartarus, which is like this abyss of hell. And kind of was him and his brother were the only two left from his family, and so he created mankind and loved them completely. And then Zeus just kind of like crapped all over that and was like, no, you're not going to have this. And then warns, mankind that, yeah, you guys are going to receive a flood. And so there's a lot of really interesting dynamics there. And I think it goes way beyond just a typical like origin myth. You almost have like a huge dichotomy between the god aspects of Prometheus and Zeus, where one's a tyrant, the other one's like an individual, a lover of man, and someone who's trying to lift up and free man.
A freedom fighter, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Well, yeah, you always bring out the most complex myths, Chad, from the group.
Sorry. I would like to just kind of briefly talk about, because I think it's interesting to note that amongst these kinds of myths, this is a list, a short list of all of the cultures that created out of clay.
Oh, interesting.
Mankind.
I was really curious to know this. Thank you.
Right. So there's about 13 of them. There's the Sumerian and Babylonian. The Enuma Elish, which we've talked about before, is the Sumerian story of Enki and Ninmah creating humans from the clay of the Absu, which is the fresh water of the underground. They take turns in creating and decreeing the fat of the humans, which is kind of like essentially what they mean is that they're measuring, the fitness of like what you would do to an animal, essentially, like pinching the fat. So it's kind of like their way of describing, like, well, is this thing fit yet? The Babylonian version, Marduk mixed Kingu's blood with the earth and used the clay to mold the first human beings, while Tiamat's body created the earth and the skies. So that's the Sumerian and the Babylonian version. Genesis, we all know. The Quran, again, God created man from clay. According to the Greek mythology, which we just went over, Prometheus. This was interesting. I didn't know this one. According to the Chinese mythology, Chu Si, in imperial readings of the Taiping era, Nua molded figures from the yellow earth, giving them life and the ability to bear children. Nua is essentially the mother goddess, and so she created man through the earth as well. Egyptian mythologies describes the god Khnum creating human children from clay before placing them in the mother's womb. Some American Indian beliefs, the earth maker formed the figure of man, of many men and women who he dried in the sun, and into it he would then breathe life.
I want to interject, actually. It didn't state that specifically from the myth I got, but there are some other derivations, like the Miwok calls it a very similar myth,
Right.
and it was made from straw and clay, according to some of the tellings.
Right, yeah. According to the Inca mythology, the god Viracocha formed human beings from clay on his second attempt at creating living creatures. The Laotian folk religion, which is like the Thai, essentially their culture. There are stories of humans being created from mud or clay. In Africa, the Yoruba culture holds that the god Obatala likewise created the human race from clay. In the Mayan myths, Tepeu and Kukulkan, which is Quetzalcoatl, made the first human beings from maize culled from the earth. The Maori, the Tane Mahuta, god of the forest, created the first woman out of clay and breathed life into her. It's kind of an interesting, switcheroo there. And in Hindu mythology, the Parvati, the mother of Ganesh, made Ganesh from clay and turned the clay into flesh and blood. And last but not least, in American folklore, Wonder Woman was sculpted from clay by her mother, Hippolyta, and given life by the Greek gods, very much like Pandora.
Modern
So,
myth.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a modern myth I had to throw in there. So that's a lot of different cultures from around the world that are using clay in some form or some aspect of the earth and water to formulate man and woman. So take that what you will, but I find that really interesting.
It's a very malleable substance.
It's
Right.
form and life.
Yeah.
You've got the water and the earth.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You have minerals, you have the water, and
One of the first artistic mediums.
yeah,
Right.
I think that may have a lot to do with it. That makes sense to me because they're shaping it. They're creating pots and clay objects and so forth.
This
So
is what
maybe,
we create with. This is what the gods.
right?
I mean, that's
exactly.
from the clue.
It's like, oh, I can make a little figurine for my daughter, put it out in the sun, and have it bake, and then that's kind of like creating a human being. Maybe that is, that's an abstraction, but at some point, I imagine that had to occur to them.
Well, it is kind of marvelous to make something, and if you put two eyes on something, your brain sees life in that.
Right.
So that's easy for them to do even back then. Oh, this is alive. Look at
Right.
it. It's looking right back at me.
That's so funny. That ties into, we're going to talk about Greek definitions. That's brings up my Greek word.
We'll save
So I
it.
said, I'll say no. Okay.
Good. Stay tuned for that one.
Stay tuned.
So let's end with a question. My question that I pose to you guys is basically, why do we have myths? And it's, there's the obvious answer that I'll just throw out there, which is myths are stories. And there's no better way to share information than from a story. If you ask somebody to memorize something, they're probably going to have a really hard time and they're going to have to work really hard at it. But if it's laid out as a story in a chronological order and you have a hero and they're achieving things, everybody can grasp that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they alter and they change through time. But it's just the easiest way to share information.
I completely agree. And to add to that, it's the demonic system that even was carried into the medieval ages. That was the system that they used, was by telling the Bible as a story and then adding pictures to it, creating essentially these symbolic representations of the story. They were able to memorize, and they wouldn't have to read, thousands of words to be able to, go, oh, I can just look at this and know where I'm at, and recall the story. And in that way, I think too, like myth ties into the constellations, and why there's a lot of correlation between the two, is that those were used. And there is some conjecture, it's not definitive, but it is believed that that's what the Druids did too. That's how they remembered their stories, was that they didn't write anything down per se, but it was the sky that they used as a mnemonic device, because those were constantly there, so that they would ascribe their knowledge and then their stories into the stars, and that would play out, and they would be able to use that as their device to remember. So
Very cool. Thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of the WordsWise Podcast. And you just watched myths, creation stories involving humans. Please share your comments. What are some other myths that we forgot? What are your views of the myths? Why do you think that we have myths? Thanks again for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.